Welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our Regional Reflections on Green Infrastructure and Nature-Based Solutions series. Today, we will be featuring green infrastructure projects from the Gulf Coast and Southeast of the United States. I'm Rebecca Eicher, a project director with the American Association for the Advancement of Science's Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues, also known as the AAAS EPI Center. The AAAS EPI Center's mission is to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers, and we're honored to be co-hosting this conversation about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in partnership with our colleagues from the US EPA Office of Water, as well as the White House. This discussion is an opportunity to hear about successes, challenges, and opportunities from the design and planning phases to implementation, to operations and maintenance of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We have a wonderful set of speakers today, and I'm happy to introduce one of our partners, Clark Wilson from the US EPA Office of Water, who will share about the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you and the AAAS staff, particularly Aaron Saybolt, who's been working behind the scenes hard on this, for organizing this webinar and this webinar series. And hello to everyone, greeting from EPA. Thanks for joining us, and I share Rebecca's thanks to our speakers who have given up their time so generously today to share their insights. As Rebecca said, this has been done in conjunction with the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative. The collaborative is a community of practice that's comprised of about 12 federal agencies that are all working in the space of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And the members of the collaborative are working closely together to share and align our knowledge and our resources to help communities build capacity and in order to maximize the environmental, economic, and the social benefits of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And a particular interest to the collaborative recently has been around fostering climate resilience and encouraging the equitable implementation of green infrastructure for all. So I am going to be putting a link into the chat to the website for the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative, where you can link to all past webinars that the collaborative has hosted. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Rebecca.
Thank you, Clark. Before we move on to the excitement and the presentations, just a bit on logistics for today. So we really encourage you all to use the chat. So first, if you want to introduce yourself, your name and the organization that you're from, and then throughout the presentation and the discussion, we really encourage you to share your ideas, resources, and experiences in the chat. Additionally, we will have the Q&A box available. So please put your questions for the presenters in the Q&A box. We want this discussion to be interactive, so we encourage you to ask questions, share ideas, and experiences. We do hope to get to as many questions as possible, but we can't promise we will get to all the questions. Please do reach out to us at the AAAS EPI Center with any follow-up questions or comments. We're delighted to have our speakers and all of you join us today. Our presenters' full bios, along with a recording of this event and their slides, will be shared on the AAAS EPI Center webpage in the coming days. So now we're ready to get started. So for our first speaker, we're thrilled to have Dr. Nick Kinsman, who's the co-lead of the Coastal Resilience Interagency Work Group, part of the White House, here to share about the working group's efforts and the White House interest in nature-based solutions. Dr. Kinsman is a coastal scientist with experience in flood and erosion management, ocean observing, and geodetic positioning. Welcome, Nick.
There we go. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here today. On behalf of the White House Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group, it's just fantastic to be here. I want to thank AAAS, EPA, and all of the people that made this happen. I know how much work these events take, and being able to bring people together around this topic in these regional webinars is just so fantastic to get this discussion into the depth that we want to be having it at. So in lieu of slides today, Emily's going to put a link in the chat with some information about the Coastal Resilience Interagency Working Group, and it includes some really great links as well. But I wanted to start out by just framing the importance of why we're here today, which I feel a little bit silly doing because I think that's probably obvious to many of you on the call. But there's a lot of really high level interest and renewed enthusiasm for the use of nature-based solutions. The White House recognizes the importance of this. David Hayes, Special Assistant to the President for Climate Policy, helped to kick off this series. And if you didn't get to see his remarks and you want to check out the previous webinar, that's available from the AAAS website. I encourage you to do that. President Biden, in his first week in office, introduced an executive order on tackling the climate crisis. It recognizes that addressing climate change requires a whole of government approach. And that EO established the Domestic Climate Policy Office, headed by Gina McCarthy, and the National Climate Task Force, which is made up of cabinet members and executive office leadership from the executive office of the president. So that executive order really set the stage. It focuses on decarbonizing and transitioning to a clean energy economy with electric vehicles, offshore wind, solar storage, but it also places, and this is something that's really new in terms of how we're talking about this at the White House level, is it places an equal emphasis on resilience through nature and conservation. For example, it includes the America the Beautiful initiative, which commits to conserve 30% of the landmass and 30% of the ocean by 2030. It talks about climate smart agriculture and forestry, and the creation of a civilian climate corps focused on nature and helping nature to serve its natural role in curbing the climate crisis. So in response to that initial executive order, which was, like I said, right at the beginning of the administration, within that first week, 5 interagency working groups were formed to focus on different impacts of climate change. These working groups are centered around extreme heat, flooding, drought, wildfire, and coastal resilience. The coastal resilience one was the first that was created, and that's the one that I'm a co-lead for. It's co-led by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the White House Council on Environmental Quality. If you take a look at the link, you can see all the different agencies that participate. And one of the reasons that this group was created was at the coast, we know that the impacts of climate change with more frequent and severe extreme weather events, sea level rise, erosion, and other stressors are challenging and in many cases devastating coastal communities, infrastructure, and the resources that our coastal economies and our entire economy depend on. So the effects of ocean warming and sea level rise are threatening the natural and built environment, and that really requires strategic investments in mitigation measures that account for changing conditions. And when we look at mitigation measures, we need to look at everything on the table. And that means having nature-based solutions on the table as well. In early conversations with leadership from many of the agencies involved in the working group, it was obvious that nature-based solutions have a vital role to play in advancing our nation's coastal resilience. So our group's really taken a focus to looking at raising and elevating the opportunities to invest in and consider nature-based solutions everywhere along the coast. So an early product of the group was the development of a compendium of federal nature-based resources for coastal communities, states, tribes, and territories. That's available online and it's at that link as well. I want to just say thanks to everyone that contributed to that early effort. It's being used in outreach efforts nationwide, just to help people connect with resources that are available out there and grow awareness about nature-based solutions at the coast. We've seen the uneven effects of hurricanes along the coast, and I'm here today speaking to a part of the country that knows that more than anyone else. When we have areas with natural solutions in place to protect the coast, we see improved outcomes. Coastal wetlands, sand dunes, and coastal vegetation can have an outsized impact on protecting the resources that we care so much about. So we know these solutions protect our environment. They're critical to marine ecosystems. They reduce flooding, they moderate extreme heat, improve water quality, biodiversity. I mean, the reasons to utilize these approaches are just so obvious. And when strategically employed, we know they can pay dividends on the resilience front from all sorts of other co-benefits as well that bolster our economy, like oyster reefs and things like that. So one of the things that I'm really excited to just emphasize today is that when we think about these strategic investments, The exciting thing that's happening is that there is more money available today than ever before to consider and employ nature-based solutions. So agencies, state, local, tribal, territorial governments have the opportunity to put these solutions in place with new funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law. It includes over $50 billion to support climate resilience at the coast and beyond. And there's a lot of emphasis on the use of natural and nature-based solutions in spending that money to enhance our resilience. So a really exciting part of that language is that it supports the use of nature-based solutions in many different programs. That means we have the resources to bring our minds together. And I want us to use this opportunity to think big and develop proof of concept projects that can really showcase the value of nature-based solutions. So on Earth Day this year, there was a new executive order that specifically called out the importance of deploying nature-based solutions as part of our approach to tackling climate change. So there's a new subgroup within the White House on nature-based solutions, and they'll be submitting a report to the National Climate Task Force that identifies opportunities for greater deployment of nature-based solutions across the federal government, including through potential policy guidance and program changes. So I've been saying this, and I'll say it again, this is a really exciting time. With this new subgroup, we have 3 offices within the White House working together as co-leads. They are bringing together experts from across our nation to think about how to reduce barriers to the adoptions and use of these approaches. And we're so excited to have all of you here today, helping to build this community of practice and thinking about this too. One of the great things I'm looking forward to in the rest of our discussion today is just highlighting some projects that are out there and happening, particularly in the Gulf and southeastern part of the United States. So if you could drop some links in there, Emily, I just wanted to highlight a few projects. In the interest of knowledge exchange, there's a project that was seeded with National Coastal Resilience funding in Jacksonville, Florida on McCoy's Creek, and it's resulted in large additional dollars from the city as well, and it has laid the groundwork for projects elsewhere in the state that are learning from it. There's also a NOAA project on Pickle Island at the Beaufort Lab in North Carolina with a living shore that's monitoring the performance of a living shoreline and the many benefits that having a living shoreline can have on the coastline there and protecting the built infrastructure. So we've got a lot to talk about today, but I really wanted to lay the foundation, give you some insights into what's happening at the White House level, and just really call your attention to the fact that this topic is receiving not only stronger interest than ever before, but is receiving funding to help make it a reality and bring these visions to life. So with that, I want to just close my remarks and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Great, thank you, Nick. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions as each of you shares your experiences and stories with us. And we will get to some of them after we hear from all of our speakers today. So make sure you put your questions in the Q&A box. So next up, we have Dr. Angela Chalk, who's a 4th generation 7th Ward resident of New Orleans. She's the founder and executive director of Healthy Community Services, a nonprofit organization located in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. Dr. Chalk will be sharing about the collaborative work she's doing in New Orleans. Angela, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Nick, let me start off by saying you're going to have to come down to New Orleans to see some of the work that we're doing here. So anytime you're ready to visit, just let me know. So thank you, Rebecca and AAAS, for allowing me this opportunity in this space to share some of the work that we're doing here in New Orleans. And if I can share the screen, just a second. I'm still not with the technology, my apologies. There it is, share screen. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right, and so as Rebecca stated, I'm Angela Chalk from Healthy Community Services. And to this disclosure, there are no relationships or conflicts present And Healthy Community Services is a nonprofit organization that's based here in the 7th Ward of New Orleans. And our scope of programming revolves around coastal resiliency and adaptation, stormwater management, and urban ag, all at the intersection of public health and climate health. And I like to say that we work at the 3 E's with engaging residents through education and empowering them to make decisions regarding their safety and resiliency. I always like to start with this quote. It's outside of the Civil Rights Center in Atlanta, and it holds true then as it is now, by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And that's certainly true of what we're doing here in New Orleans. And our objectives today will demonstrate the building of trusted networks and how we engage the residents here in New Orleans, and how we have built equity in communities of colors by creating paths to funding access, and educating residents on how we can do that. Examples of our community organizations working together towards common goals, because we cannot work in silos. This issue of climate change is not just a one size fits all, and all of us have certain skills and tasks and expertise that requires us to work together, but it has to be in trusted relationships in order for it to be sustainable. And then we're working for the benefit, not only for the communities that we serve, but the outcomes. In African-American communities, we can't get this wrong, because as you all know, we're the first to be impacted and the last to recover. And so we have to get this right. We have no room for error in doing this work. And so in starting with engagement, that means using your professional work networks in order to work with communities. Through research, we can do that by working with academic institutions and staying relevant in our field as we grow and learn. And then for each of us, we're learning to develop an area of expertise, whether that's working with native plants or engaging our youth to become the next leaders in this generation of climate change. And let me tell you, these young people are grasping the concept of becoming environmental stewards, and they're taking the charge and they're leading the way on how we're going to change the world of resiliency and environmental stewardship. And just remember that in working in communities, you're not doing something to communities, you're working with communities and you're respecting the members of those communities. And as African Americans, involve the elders and the children and youth, because all of us have something important to say. The elders can teach us the things of the past that are still relevant today. And the youth now, I'm learning that social media is one of those things that this is their world through social media and technology, and we can marry those forces in messaging. And so education is reciprocal. You learn from the people that you teach, and you also receive information from your peers, both locally and nationally. I know that I do, but most importantly, this work is about the residents that you are working with in the communities that are affected. So continue to stay current on best practices in your discipline. What you're looking at here is what we call the Vision to Reality Stormwater Management Site. Through listening with residents, we've taken a site that's on a hurricane evacuation route that was a rutted out area that now manages 35,000 gallons of stormwater capacity. That's on a hurricane evacuation route. And Healthy Community Services was the lead community organization on this project with funding through the Institute for Sustainable Communities. And we were intentional about who we hired to both construct and lead that program, that project. And we use workers from Groundworks New Orleans. And these young men now have skills in green infrastructure, who were formerly incarcerated or who had previous contact with the criminal justice system. And now these young men went from workforce training to now having high wage earning employment starting off at $18 per hour. And that's real change in communities of color. So the funding, at the beginning, there is no, you don't just jump from having an idea to getting funding. It's an incremental phase. So at the beginning, you start at the neighborhood level, and it oftentimes involves investing your own money. And then building the reputation of the brand of your organization in your community. And that often involves receiving sponsorship from small local businesses or professional organizations or fraternities and sororities. Reach out to those organizations to help you to improve the efforts of your community. And from there, you may need a fiduciary agent to help you to build your brand and act on your behalf before you can become a 501c3 organization. Seek out support from local philanthropic agencies and then move on to national philanthropic organizations. I am happy to report that Healthy Community Services is an organization now that has received its first federal grant through the EPA with access from the Justice 40. And so through that, we have built and protected our brand and established sustainable relationships that will allow us to bring 7 to 10 additional projects along the North Claiborne corridor, which is a business corridor, to businesses to retrofit those businesses for green infrastructure interventions. In building out our assets and empowering residents, we have 160 neighborhood champions across the Waterwise Gulf South Collective with 6 community organizations. And all of those 6 community organizations are led by African-American women. We have one study research project, but most importantly, just recently, we will be developing and showcasing a prototype home that will be a resilient home, and it's featured in the Georgetown Climate Center's case study review that was just released. Just remember that whatever you're doing, you have an impact on the residents. We use green infrastructure because it takes a community to be a community, and we're using art to demonstrate not only the cultural and social injustices, but reflecting how we install green infrastructure interventions, not only through art, but gathering the community to do these green infrastructure interventions. Currently, we have one research project that's unfunded, but we're working with researchers from the University of Michigan and Dillard University. We're able to issue real-time heat alerts. This is a solar-powered weather station. To date, we've planted 547 trees, and that research targeted area is a 4x2 square block area. This station also serves as shelter for bikers. At current, our capacity, stormwater management capacity is 100,000 gallons of water per rain event. It's taken us 7 years to reach that milestone, but by the end of 2022, our capacity will be an additional 100,000 gallons of capacity of water per rain event. We all know that green infrastructure is good for our environment by improving air quality, reducing the urban heat island effect, improving ecosystems and natural habitats. The American Medical Association has adopted a statement and a policy of declaring climate change a public health crisis that threatens the health and well-being of all persons. But most importantly, the effects of climate change requires that this is a multi-jurisdictional approach because watersheds does not know boundaries. And so the actions now that are being taken on the ground are community driven, and don't disregard the benefits of community science and the roles that residents play in those areas that are most impacted by climate change. Currently, Earth Economics has valued our current and proposed projects with the Waterwise Gulf South Collective at $17 million. And we have our public health benefits study that will be issued in the spring of 2023. The picture that you see here is the beginning of the life cycle of shrimp. So if those of you who enjoy fresh shrimp know that Our natural habitat is coming back because the vegetation in the wetlands is becoming more and more healthy as we rebuild the wetlands of Southeast Louisiana. Again, allow residents and empower residents to make those decisions that are best for their communities. So when we are going into communities to work with communities, residents are the ones who knows best what their communities need and want based on cultural and social norms. Nature-based solutions work and they're inexpensive to implement, because if not, the alternatives are continued flooding caused by climate change. And in New Orleans, we have an aged infrastructure. And so I'm not saying that we have to get rid of our pumps, pipes, and drains, but we need to be able to marry and complement nature-based solutions along with the pumps, pipes, and drains. And so none of this work that we do is in silos. So the community-based organizations work collaboratively for the good of our communities, because it takes a community to be a community, and we all live in the same community and want the best for our city. But most importantly, this work could not be possible without our funders. The funders believe in us, they believe in the work, and we have demonstrated, we've demonstrated to our funders that we are capable and able, and we perform the duties and meet our deliverables timely as community organizations. And so my challenge to each of you is to preserve your mental health, step out of your comfort zone, leave communities with those sustainable and tangible assets, and always remember that you are the change factor, positive or negative. Last week, I stepped out of my comfort zone and held an alligator that was fresh from the wetlands. And no, there is no rubber band around this alligator's mouth. This alligator was fresh from the wetlands. And so if I want the residents that I serve to believe in what I'm doing, I have to step that efforts up and demonstrate it through what I'm saying and teaching. And so this is frozen, but that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all very much for your time. But again, never doubt that a small group of people, thoughtful, committed citizens, can change the world. Thank you.
Angela, thank you for sharing how nature-based solutions are having a direct impact on communities in New Orleans and the work that you're doing with your colleagues. So next up, we have Amy Pickle, who directs the state policy program at the Duke University Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Today, she'll be sharing about a collaborative project between Duke University, Pew Charitable Trust, and the Department of Defense in North Carolina. So welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And thanks everyone for your attention and for having me here. Let me see if I can get this up and going. Oh, no. Let's try that. Okay, so I want to back up one slide. That's what I want to do. So I want to talk with you today about this project that we've been using as a case study in Eastern North Carolina. And I want to start with a particular thanks to the Pew Charitable Trust for both funding this project and for being a critical thought partner in both the project itself and in thinking through this case study. So this is
Amy, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we just need you to go into presentation mode. We're seeing
I am in presentation mode on my screen. Gracious. Let's try this.
That was it, actually.
Oh, was it? Of course. Let's try again. Okay, I'm in presentation mode for me. Am I in presentation mode for all of you?
You are not. We're seeing the whole. So someone is giving us instructions. Press swap displays.
Press swap displays.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of Zoom.
If I knew where I was
Top left. top left or top right? We're getting instructions. In
I
the
love
moment.
this in real time. Okay, I cannot find that. So let me try one more time. So have I now stopped sharing?
You have.
Okay. So then let me give one more. Okay, let's see that.
Okay, so it says at the top where you see the time running, there's a swap
Oh, there it
next
is.
to tips.
How about that?
Perfect.
Yay. Thanks. And thanks for everybody's patience and instructions. Learn something new every day. Okay, let's go back to this introductory slide. So the MCA-SP is the Marine Corps Air Station at Cherry Point in North Carolina. It is obviously a military base in North Carolina. And the purpose of this project was to both incorporate real-time science into the design process for this living shoreline that I'll talk about in a second. And then for my part of it, to use this process to identify funding and design and permitting barriers and enabling conditions that might create a pathway for success for more nature-based solutions like this living shoreline on other military bases. Before I get into the presentation, I want to pause and just say, what is a living shoreline, so that we all have that in our mind. I know I'm preaching to the choir with many folks in the room. So a living shoreline is a type of green infrastructure that is generally comprised of a stabilized coastal edge that has natural materials in it. So salt marsh plantings, oysters, or rock. There's a gradient of green to gray infrastructure. NOAA has an excellent website that describes living shorelines. The living shoreline that we'll talk about here for Cherry Point has a marsh sill and marsh plantings and an oyster component that will be critical for you to remember as we move to the next bit. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but I want to emphasize a couple of pieces from it. For one thing, let's just start with the size. This is a 2.3 mile long living shoreline that is along this edge of the military base of Cherry Point's space. So you can see the proposed living shoreline in red in the picture above. So that scope and scale is a very unusual living shoreline. There was at one point, we thought it might be the longest living shoreline proposed in the country. I'm not sure whether it's retained that title or not, but it is one of significant scope and scale. The second thing I want to emphasize is the overall site context. So this is the Neuse River that's just on the other side. For those of you familiar with North Carolina, the Neuse is a very prominent river, both in our media and our news and our restoration efforts. So the Neuse River and in and around this site is a relatively shallow area that's primarily wind-driven tides, and freshwater discharge are the big aquatic things that are moving or increasing the erosion rate around the edge of the property. Doesn't have a lot of tidal areas. There's significant erosion around the existing hardened structures for this area, and that erosion rate has been we've lost about 110 feet of that property to erosion since 1994. So a significant amount and a significant concern for the base. And importantly, for the science component, there are no oysters that are found directly in this area. The third thing I want to emphasize is just the role of science in getting this up and going. You can see the extensive project partner list for the project itself. It includes the resource agencies, as you would expect, academics and consultants who are bringing in that technical and scientific expertise into the design and permitting process. So the overall restoration plan has a 2.3 mile offshore marsh sill, so a structure that creates an opportunity for the shoreline to naturally gain more sediment, marsh plantings that will be in there, and there was an opportunity for oyster restoration. The Duke team on the science side conducted extensive field work to assess both the marsh plantings and the viability of oyster restoration in the area. The last thing I'll mention is just the price tag for a 2.3 mile living shoreline. You can see the multiple funding sources get you to about $9.4 million for the overall project. So let's jump right to the quick. What are the lessons that we've gained from looking at this case study? So similar to Angela, and I'm sure we'll hear this repeatedly, engage early, engage often. The collaborative partnerships that formed the nucleus of the kitchen cabinet or the thought leaders for the project were really critical. So they were engaged early in both the design plans to identify multiple funding sources, match up those funding sources with the design and components of the living shoreline itself, and to get overall early project buy-in. The second and key for the Duke scientists who were involved is how important engaging with that technical and scientific expertise early was for this particular project. By engaging on the technical and scientific side, the Cherry Point project was able to really learn from groups that had been working in community to build smaller living shorelines for a long time. So the Coastal Federation in particular, and on the science side to learn how the existing water quality and habitat conditions influence the project. And so to incorporate that into the design itself early so the design could flex as the information came in and develop overall funding proposals and partnerships with these groups. Important for getting buy-in on the base. One of the most interesting things to me about the project is how do we move from not doing this very often, or how do we scale up restoration to this level? And important for the Cherry Point project internally was that they already had experience with nature-based solutions. So there had been a previous stream restoration project that was on base that the base viewed as important. They saw that the value and the services provided for that stream restoration, and were able to make that mental switch from let's build a bulkhead to we already know that living natural solutions work, and we can think through how that might be scaled up for a project like this living shoreline. Lastly, for funding and design, I'll emphasize that the amount of funding needed to come, because the funding that was needed was so large to have a project of this scale, the funding sources were quite diverse, and Cherry Point did an amazing job of getting funding, attacking funding when they had that opportunity. So when resilience funding became available post-hurricane, Cherry Point was able to leverage that funding and then bring in both state funding sources and other federal grants to make a project as big and comprehensive as this one. So the project's moved forward to permitting, and there were a number of interesting lessons on the permitting side, because the permitting system that we have is not really equipped to handle projects of this scope and scale. So there's been work by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that I think has been quite successful to have a nationwide permit 54, to facilitate the adoption of smaller, more private property, residential-based living shorelines. So that has been great and has been a program that North Carolina in particular has emphasized through both the Coastal Federation and the state coastal agencies. have really worked hard to both educate the consulting community and reduce permitting and administrative barriers for these kinds of living shorelines for properties. They are, however, 500 feet or less. So if we want to scale up, if we want to have large scale restoration projects of the sort that we're talking about for Cherry Point, that nationwide permit is great for the small project and doesn't apply to the project at Cherry Point because of the scope and the scale. That means they fall under an individual permit. And, as a recovering lawyer, we'll say that, an individual permit is just orders of magnitude more resource intensive to get that permit through the process. And the amount of coordination is also exponentially greater for an individual permit. So the information you need, the coordination across state and federal permitting agencies, bringing in the resource agencies, really kind of froze the design of Cherry Point at a point that it hadn't yet incorporated some of the scientific information. So going forward, that early engagement with the resource agencies and the permitting agencies and the scientific and technical community to make sure that the design is responsive to the permitting needs. So, for example, for the project at Cherry Point, there was a push by the resource agencies to have adequate fish passage within the marsh sill. There was a prohibition on backfill. So the marsh planting species needed to be modified in order to accommodate the permitting requirements that prohibited the backfill. So the early marsh plantings that will be part of this project are colonizing species that are able to withstand the more dynamic environment that is before the sediment starts to build up and before that living shoreline comes out. So I'm happy to talk about the details on any of this, but things to remember: scope and scale matters. Get science involved early and often, and talk soon, talk early, talk with as many people as possible for funding, for design, and to facilitate the permitting piece of these kinds of projects. And that's my reminder to stop talking. So thanks very much, and apologies for the technical difficulties.
Amy, thank you. Thanks for sharing about this collaborative nature-based solution and the lessons learned at Cherry Point. It's a really interesting example of living shorelines along the coast. So I'm pleased to introduce our next and final speaker, Dr. Chris Shepard. Chris is the Director of Science for the Gulf of Mexico program with the Nature Conservancy. Her primary research focuses on assessing coastal hazards risk, quantifying the role coastal habitats play in reducing risk, and identifying where ecosystem-based approaches such as conservation or restoration are likely to be effective for risk reduction. Welcome, Chris.
Hello. All right, it seems like we're all set. Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to share about the SUNS project today. SUNS stands for Scaling Up Nature-Based Solutions. And I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about how this project was conceived and what the goals are and where we are at now. We are at the start of year 2 of the project. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the process for this project because it is a bit different than any previous nature-based solutions effort I've been engaged in, as far as the scale and the number of projects that we have been developing simultaneously, and also engaging in this multi-jurisdictional effort through the pandemic. So as mentioned, I'm the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy's Gulf of Mexico program. I work across the 5 Gulf of Mexico states, and this project in particular touches down in the Florida Panhandle. I'd like to acknowledge our project team, which is comprised of folks from the Nature Conservancy, Northeastern University, the Northwest Florida Water Management District, and the U.S. Naval Academy. We've had tremendous support from a NOAA Digital Coast Fellow, Anna Jane Jones, who we've hosted for nearly 2 years now. She's served as the project manager for SUNS. My role on the project is as project director, and Anna Jane has done a really tremendous job and been a tremendous asset to this project from day one. So the SUNS project was conceived of shortly after Hurricane Michael impacted the Florida Panhandle in 2018. The most impacted communities along the coastal area of the Panhandle were 3 coastal counties, 2 of which are mostly rural with cities and some socially vulnerable communities. It's an area of exceptional natural importance, and there's a lot of land conservation that's already taken place across parts of this region. But immediately after the storm, we were fortunate enough to receive funding from the Walton Family Foundation to partner with Northeastern University on a science project to try and understand the role of nature, if any, in mitigating risk from Hurricane Michael, and also if the residents in these communities perceive the benefits of nature and the habitats along this region. And the results from that study were really informative in that folks that had spent a long time living in these communities did acknowledge that natural shorelines, salt marsh areas do play a role in their resilience. And they found that if they had a more natural shoreline, their natural shorelines performed equally as well as hardened seawalls, yet they had the benefit of not having to repair those natural shorelines after the storm. So it saved them money in the long term. So based on the results of that study, we applied for funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's National Coastal Resilience Fund to develop the SUNS project. And the reason that we did that was because based on our experience and working on nature-based solutions for over a decade, we felt pretty strongly that really building resilience should involve a concerted regional effort that fully considers the role of nature and nature-based infrastructure. So really moving from thinking about individual projects where possible to kind of scaling up and thinking at more of a system level. Additionally, funding for nature-based solutions, as mentioned earlier today, nationally and specifically in Florida, has never been more available. Yet smaller communities with less capacity and less resources are often missing out on these funds because they haven't had dedicated time or capacity to visualize or plan for what they might do with respect to nature-based solutions in their own communities. So that's how we developed the SUNS project. We focus on Bay, Gulf, and Franklin counties. You can see here on the map where that is in the Panhandle of Florida. So this is the area most impacted by Hurricane Michael. But again, an opportunity space for thinking about how would we scale up nature-based solutions across the region to really harness the power of nature and increasing resilience and reducing risk. So the goals of the SUNS project are threefold. The first one is to provide local government staff, planners, and communities with decision-making knowledge and tools. So there are a lot of tools out there with respect to nature-based solutions, risk mitigation planning, but we wanted to kind of bring together a set of resources that already were in existence to the communities in this region to help them think about planning for NBS. Second, we wanted to form a stakeholder-based process that we could lead a working group through a process to develop a portfolio of nature-based solutions across the region. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there really isn't a process in existence to do something like this. So we took elements of various planning processes for planning for nature-based solutions and attempted to scale them up across a larger area and multiple jurisdictions to create a portfolio of projects across the 3 counties. And then the third component, the third goal of SUNS rather, is to encourage adoption and implementation of the portfolio by providing technical assistance and capacity building. So once we have the portfolio finalized, we're committed to working in the region and helping to support the working group members to apply for funding and implement the projects in the portfolio. So what will the SUNS portfolio be? The SUNS portfolio is a suite of 60 to 75 nature-based solutions projects that align with regional strategies of importance to the SUNS working group members, are suitable for various funding programs. They're projects that reduce risk and benefit fish and wildlife. So those are the kind of 4 major criteria for what we're looking for in the SUNS portfolio of projects. The final products will be a document and a map that detail each nature-based solutions project type and location, the likely project benefits, the regional or strategic importance of each project and how they're linked to others in the SUNS region, and potential funding sources for implementation. So the SUNS portfolio can be used to scale up funding and construct nature-based solutions projects in this region to reduce risks and benefit fish and wildlife. So again, we're going from thinking about what is an appropriate nature-based solution in one location to thinking about what are a suite of nature-based solutions projects that, when implemented across the region, can augment fish and wildlife habitat while reducing risk and increasing resilience to the communities that live here. So how did we go about doing this? The major steps for building the portfolio, the first one was to engage a working group for 1 year. We stood up the working group last summer in July, so we're coming to our 1 year mark. I have a slide coming up that kind of shows the representatives on the working group, but it was mostly representatives from local governments and state and federal agencies that are engaged or manage assets related to nature-based solutions. And before we stood up, we had a series of interviews with folks already working in the region on nature-based solutions so that we could understand what projects are already way, where people's mindsets are about nature-based solutions, and what kind of educational components we might need to include in the beginning of the working group. The second part of this is the suitability analysis. So where is it suitable? Where are the suitable locations for implementing nature-based solutions? So these were not super rigorous suitability indices that we are intending to publish in peer-reviewed manuscripts, but rather they are very simplified, where possible, maps of where there are opportunities on the landscape for potentially implementing nature-based solutions. And I'll share some of those in a minute. So the working group really dictated what types of hazards we were planning for, what kinds of project types they were interested in, and where their priority locations were. Most of that information was gathered through virtual monthly meetings. And then this project was funded, as I mentioned, through a NIFWIF National Coastal Resilience Fund grant for planning. This slide just shows the partners that are participants on the working group. As I mentioned, this project kicked off during the pandemic, so we had to start a new 3-county project virtually, which was a bit of a challenge. I'm personally very committed to icebreakers. We had those at every meeting, learned a lot about each other. Fortunately, now that times have improved, we have had some in-person meetings. Last week, our project team was in the region for a couple of days of workshops, and we were able to overcome a lot of the challenges associated with virtual engagement and virtual planning. This slide here shows a little bit about the process for developing the portfolio. So we wanted to bring simple maps where possible to the working group to highlight where in their own communities there may be opportunities for implementing different types of nature-based solutions in their landscape and on their shorelines. And so, as I mentioned, the group really was driving the bus with respect to what types of hazards were of primary importance, what types of nature-based solutions they wanted to plan for, and then how we were characterizing priority fish and wildlife habitat areas. So where data already existed, we tried to use those data sources, and then where it did not, our science team, primarily through Northeastern University, was able to provide us with some support and maps to kind of support this area for the working group. So what we did was we derived these nature-based solutions opportunity areas that we brought into a series of workshops where we did visioning exercises to really think about where would you develop projects, where do your risk areas and your priority neighborhoods overlap with these opportunity areas. So this slide here shows some of the opportunity maps that we developed for SUNS. Each of the colors represents a different type of nature-based solution. So each community was able to kind of zoom to their community through a bookmark on this map app that we created, and really see just in very simple colors where different solutions might be possible. And where there are multiple colors showing up together, that means that there are multiple types of nature-based solutions that could be implemented together in concert to really harness the habitats and the potential for restoring the habitats in these areas to stabilize shorelines and reduce risk. So we also, as I mentioned at the beginning of the project, we had extensive one-on-one interviews to try and understand where the existing efforts were, because we didn't want SUNS to be redundant to things that were already happening. So we mapped out the footprint of existing or planned projects. And together in the map app, we were able to map where the existing projects are and where the opportunities areas are. And then we organized a series of 4 workshops, and each one of them focused on a regional theme in which the communities were provided a process and time to really look at the opportunity maps in their own context of their own community and think about and envision potential projects. So we shared examples from elsewhere in the Gulf of Mexico and in the state of Florida to really kind of show them what might be possible in their own backyard. And then we showed them the opportunity maps so they could kind of see where we think these different nature-based solutions types might be feasible. And then using the map app, they were actually able to draw polygons on the landscape of where they had different ideas based on their knowledge of local flooding, and also some of the supporting layers that we brought in, such as the NOAA flood exposure mapping tools, risk data, and also information about the state of Florida's habitat priorities. So after that series of these 4 workshops that wrapped up in April, we ended up with 140 projects in the SUNS map app, which was more than we were anticipating, but we were very excited about that. So you can see each of the project types that were suggested by members of the working group here on the map. So then we needed to move into the phase in which we're currently in for SUNS of how do we prioritize amongst these 140 projects to really develop the strongest portfolio of nature-based solutions projects that has the potential to benefit the most communities, potential to benefit potentially socially vulnerable communities, and provide the most benefits for fish and wildlife habitat. So we developed a series of criteria that we were able to mostly assess using GIS related to the number of properties around each project, the levels of critical infrastructure around each project, the potential to benefit vulnerable communities, as well as alignment with our kind of key principles of wanting to protect or augment priority habitat areas, and also alignment with the NOAA flood exposure composite layer, so areas that are at risk. We also included scoring for potential recreational amenities. Regional recreation economic development was already a theme that some of the communities were already working on through a project led by EPA. And I think some of the folks from EPA from the working group are on the phone today. So where we landed with the 140 projects, once we ran them through the screening criteria, is that we found a range of between 8 and 17 for the scoring, and we decided to include as yes included in the portfolio of projects, any projects that scored above average. And then we have a maybe and a not now and a needs details category. And so where we are right now is we just came off a week long of workshops with our working group members to really talk through what these various project ideas are, where they landed with respect to the screening criteria, and really get their feedback on their key priorities for projects to include in the portfolio. I am going to share these slides as others have mentioned, so you can kind of see the geographic distribution, because we've kind of been reviewing that along the way to ensure that there's kind of equity as far as the distribution of projects across the region and with respect to some of the smaller communities. So where we are now is that we're finalizing the SUNS portfolio of projects next month. And then moving on from there, we do have the science team from Northeastern University working on some project benefit calculations. And we have each of the members of the working group working on case sheets that outline each project, what the project is, what the goals are, and what the likely benefits are. We'll bring that information in from the science team to develop a nice case sheet for each of these projects. And we intend to have the final SUNS report done in October. And the most important piece of this project, and the part of this project that I'm most excited about, is that this project doesn't end with the development of the portfolio. That's really the first step. From the portfolio of projects, we have funding both from within the original planning grant from NIFWF and with an add-on grant that we were fortunate to receive from the Walmart Foundation, we have enough funding to support a selection of the SUNS projects to move towards implementation. So we will be assisting the working group members in proposal writing, providing engineering contractor support, partner and funding coordination, and letters of support. So the Nature Conservancy and our partners, the Northwest Florida Water Management District and the St. Andrews Estuary Program, were very committed to helping to move the portfolio towards implementation and helping these communities to build the confidence and capacity to receive and secure the nature-based solutions funding, and continue to use those opportunity maps that we developed to plan for and secure funding for future projects. So thank you very much for listening to my talk today about SUNS. We really feel that the SUNS process can be used to scale up funding and construct NBS projects at the regional scale to reduce risk to underserved communities and benefit fish and wildlife, not only across the Gulf of Mexico, but really anywhere that has a reasonable level of GIS data, and that really is the entire North America shoreline. And we think that it's really important that we try to provide capacity for these communities that might not otherwise have the capacity to access this funding. We can really make a difference for both people and nature in the areas that we can apply a process like SUNS. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. This is fantastic to see so much of the planning and examples. And we're really looking forward to the final SUNS report when it does come out. So I know that it will be fun to get to the questions, but before we do that, we wanted to actually poll all our attendees and learn a little bit from you all. So if you had attended our last regional reflection, these questions are the same. So we're trying to hear from you for your regional perspective and learn a little bit as we're going, as much as we're sharing. So our first question for you all is, what types of case studies and examples would you like to see highlight green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? And in this case, you can select all that apply. So go ahead and answer those. We'll leave this up for a little bit. Getting lots of great participation. Thank you. The numbers are climbing, which is why I'm just letting it keep going. As that one continues on and you think about your answers there, the second question is really a more regional question. So what do you consider to be the dominant hazard in the Gulf Coast and Southeast region that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions need to address? In this case, you do have to pick. So you can pick only one. You all are so efficient. You saw that there were 2 questions and you've already answered. So we'll give it another couple of seconds. 5 seconds if anybody's wavering and can't quite pick. Well, this is great. We've had 77% of you participate. So we can go ahead and close the poll. And then you can see here. So let's give this a quick look. So the types of case studies or examples you all would like to see more of, municipal green stormwater infrastructure solutions. So we can certainly keep that in mind. Green infrastructure and environmental justice. Those are the top 2 that I'm seeing. And then there are always great questions and interest around long-term operations and maintenance. So I should say we still have a couple more of these webinars for regional reflections. So we will be moving to other regions throughout the US, including the Great Lakes, the Southwest, and the Northwest. And we do take these answers into account as we plan for our next set of webinars. So we'll work to find some municipal examples for you for the next set. So when we're thinking about the dominant hazard in the Gulf Coast and Southeast, it looks like it is a pretty close answer here for coastal resilience and flooding. So really appreciate you all sharing that with us. And it's really helpful for us to think about where people have concerns and how we can help address some of those concerns through these webinars, as well as connecting experts with folks. So please do keep letting us know. I will also say we are very encouraged by the answered questions in the Q&A. So if you have questions for any of the panelists, now is your chance to put those in the Q&A box. And I can start us off with a question. So if all the speakers would go ahead and turn their cameras back on, and you can join me on the stage. Great, thank you. So the first question that I'll kick us off with, and I think we'll probably get to hear from each of you for this one. So how have communities and decision makers' perceptions about green infrastructure and nature-based solutions evolved over time? And Nick, I think you were going to share a little bit from the federal side first. So if you want to start us off.
I'm happy to. I really like this question because from the decision makers and so the policy making side, we are really seeing a shift. I think none of us would be surprised to see nature-based solutions be encouraged in a lot of the work that's ongoing right now to tackle the climate crisis. But what's different is we're moving from this encouraging the consideration within existing programs and funding opportunities to thinking about taking proactive action to promote the greater deployment of these solutions. So we're seeing that shift, and we're seeing it in the language that's coming out around the budget and funding opportunities, and even in the executive order I mentioned that's linked in the Q&A. Instead of saying solutions to tackle climate change and enhance resilience and then having nature-based solutions couched under there as a section, all of section 4 in that executive order is titled Deploying Nature-Based Solutions to Tackle the Climate Crisis. It's called out as its own section as opposed to just being tucked under as an approach. And when we think about taking that proactive action, that may mean going in and making modifications to policy or guidance or even federal programs themselves. And we're thinking about that, and we're bringing people together to have that conversation now. So I think we're shifting in the sense that we're thinking about nature-based solutions not just as something that we can consider and utilize within existing programs, but building programs that directly support their deployment.
Thank you, and thanks for pointing out those key parts of where we can find more information. Amy, I think you were going to share a little bit about the work at Cherry Point and how that fits in here.
Yeah, I want to emphasize, I think, 2 points. One is that resilience has really opened up, I think, an interest in green infrastructure, just that shift of frame, particularly for the military bases. So as they think about resilience to climate change, and you look at the Cherry Point project in particular and other base military installations that have engaged in larger green nature-based solutions or green infrastructure projects, their frame is really around long-term base resilience. And I think that mental shift from, are we going to plant something or are we going to build a hardened seawall we need to be more resilient for a longer period of time in the face of evolving goals or impacts related to climate change, has shifted us from a static gray infrastructure, right, to something that is dynamic and responsive and that can hopefully be more resilient at the end of the day than those hardened structures would be in similar circumstances. And I think that shift in the frame for federal decision makers in particular has really, for military installations, has opened up funding and ways of thinking about resilience that weren't there 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And then the other piece that I would highlight is North Carolina's efforts in particular, not related to Cherry Point, but I alluded to them earlier. North Carolina has done a significant amount of work in just putting up green living shorelines for private residences versus bulkheads in a way that makes those living shorelines, you're like, oh yeah, that actually works better. That's something that I can do as a homeowner that looks better, that feels better, that is something that I'm more interested in the bulkhead, and then in reducing barriers or access to information and permitting for individuals, I think has gone a long way. And North Carolina has really taken the bull by the horns to move that forward.
Yeah.
And for us, Rebecca, in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, we're working class people. And what are working class people doing? We're working. And so the issue of the terminologies around resiliency, climate change, sea level rise, those are just terms that are thrown out there until the issue becomes acute when we have urban floodings. But through the outreach and engagement and meeting people where they are and educating, engaging, and empowering folks to understand that our climate is changing, that sea level rise impacts us, realizing that although New Orleans is an urban setting, we are not that far from the coast, meaning the Gulf of Mexico, the value and the importance of the wetlands, the value and the importance of the Mississippi River. When we start to make the connections of all of those entities or the impacts, then people start to be able to make decisions for their communities and their families. And that's all that we're doing in bringing those nature-based solutions for people to make incremental behavioral changes that will impact them. As a collective, working with the folks that I work with, especially in my neighborhood, not everyone is a green infrastructure expert. And I'm glad to know that they are. They understand the value of trees in our neighborhoods in cooling down and reducing the urban heat island effect. They understand how a French drain works or a rain garden, or that the native plants that we have, that they're beneficial to our ecosystem. And so when we bring all of those measures together to communities of color, that's empowering and it's life-changing. And the jobs that come from that, the entrepreneurial spirit that spurs off from learning about nature-based solution, that's life-changing for us. It may not be life-changing for anyone else in privileged communities, but that's life-changing for us because those are careers that can supplement everyday people's regular jobs. And so that's what, again, as an African-American woman, we can't get this wrong. I can't get this wrong. And so the challenge for all of you who live in communities, no matter where you are across this region, is to remember that you are a part of the community that you live and work in and serve, whether you realize it or not. And we have no room for error because nature is relentless and it's not going to give up unless we begin to make those changes and make those incremental behavioral changes.
Yeah, thank you. And Chris, I'm sure you can also share some perspective here too.
Sure, I just wanted to note that science has played a big role in the adoption of nature-based solutions. And early days, the science was about just trying to detect if nature could do anything to help with the ever-increasing threats from coastal flooding and sea level rise. And now the science has advanced to the point where it's really documented the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. And has really helped with the adoption and implementation, as well as the ever increasing funding. So I think, the evolving science over time, as well as the increasing amount of funding, has really brought some folks to the table that maybe weren't early adopters or really thinking about nature-based solutions. But I think the funding is helpful in driving that conversation, and also the amount of time that has gone by since some of the early projects have been implemented. And we've seen that they can, and hurricanes and kind of a range of storm conditions over time. So I think documenting that scientifically is still critically important.
Yeah, and really appreciate bringing up the science component and where it is and how it is evolving. And, we've heard in other listening sessions that we've hosted that there are still some questions as local and state folks are considering green infrastructure, where they can find that information to show the benefits or what green infrastructure can address, or nature-based solutions. So really appreciate you mentioning that as well. I do see that there is a question that came in from the audience that I thought it might be interesting to hear from you all about. So this is from Naomi. She said, in her own professional experience, an informed citizenry provides the greatest collaborative initiatives. What sort of information or education are you sharing with citizens to facilitate their participation and taking ownership? And I think, we would think of communities. How do we do that? And what kind of information do we share?
I'll take that because I'm experiencing that on a daily basis. When we put in green infrastructure interventions, it's an opportunity for those folks who don't quite understand the science behind it or the mechanism behind it, an opportunity to come out, and we call them work and learn sessions. So it allows folks to come out, to be engaged, to hands-on if they want to participate in the construction of these interventions, especially if they're small scale on private property. And through the network of neighborhood champions, this is how some of those projects are built. And so you get to see the functionality of it from construction until we wait till rainfall. And I tell you all the time, Rebecca, I play a lot in the rain so that we can see the projects as they work. And once residents see that the intervention actually works and it's functioning properly, then that begins to pique the curiosity of other residents when they see what is happening. When you no longer are stepping into a puddle of water, or there's no longer rainfall pooling in your backyard, that's a significant impact to residents. The use of native plants to infiltrate water to the ground, and then when you see a native iris bloom or a native plant bloom, that's life-changing. When you see a tree, a native tree that's planted that grows, and now it provides shade for you, and it's decreased the temperature in the neighborhood by 2 degrees, neighbors have a sense of ownership of those trees, that's life-changing. And that's what we're doing in our communities here in New Orleans. We're providing life-changing experiences with the benefit of nature-based solutions.
Thank you. That is really, really helpful examples. And as you see the hearts going by. And I think this gets a little bit to questions around scale. So there's a question for Amy in the Q&A about what would be a normal scale for a living shoreline. But I'd also kind of like to pose it to all of you to talk just a little bit about project scale and community to watershed to broader scales. So Amy, if you want to start us off with what would be normal?
Well, I hate to peg something as normal. I will say that a lot of work in green infrastructure has fallen into 2 buckets. One is the residential or community scale, so smaller. So the work that certainly that the Corps has done in streamlining permitting and thinking through decisions for living shorelines is really zeroing in on community scale or private residence scale living shoreline work. And then you have huge sort of municipal projects or like this living shoreline at Cherry Point that are scaled exponentially from those smaller community rain gardens. And so there, and I would love to hear from the other panelists too. There isn't so much in the middle. And, one of the interesting places that we've thought about with respect to Cherry Point is just if you're going to work with military-based resilience, that bigger scale is really important. And one of the things that came out from the case study is that there are some design and permitting barriers that might make that bigger scale, which might have more human and sort of public health and ecosystem benefits, that bigger scale project. There are barriers to getting those tackled that have been addressed maybe for the smaller projects. So scaling up still has a long way to go. And the efforts have been focused, what efforts there have been focused on that smaller community, sort of streamlining the administrative burden on that side.
I wanted to add in that as we sort of dive in and think more about the different barriers to adoption, the thing that keeps coming up time and time again is that when it comes to nature-based solutions, there's never any one-size-fits-all solution. And that's one of the things that's difficult to navigate in terms of breaking down the barriers too. And connecting to that question about an engaged citizenry, I think that's the real value, like Dr. Clark said, about coming together and working together on this, because we can share those different experiences across the scales and figure out what solutions are needed to break down the barriers regardless of the project type, because I think it really can run the full gambit of different sizes and scales when it comes to nature-based solutions.
I would just add, just to kind of connect this question to the last one, and that for SUNS, the project ideas in their current state are really just mostly ideas. Some of them have proceeded to the development of conceptual designs throughout the SUNS process, but some of them are really just ideas at this point, where we've helped kind of provide a context and a process for coming up with those ideas. So we do have our working group members right now identifying projects that are in need of more community engagement. Let's take this idea, because there's no details surrounding it yet, to the communities that have been identified by the leadership, their elected officials, and see how they feel about it. Do they want this in their community? What would they want it to look like? What are the additional benefits that they're looking for? So we tried to screen out where we think different solutions might be appropriate, but right now they really just are ideas. And we're really fortunate that we were able to get the additional funding from the Walmart Foundation that will really truly take it from a planning project to a community engagement project, because without that additional funding, that step kind of sometimes gets skipped or left out, where the projects move from an idea to a design without that critical piece that Dr. Chalk mentioned.
Yeah, and Chris, I have some colleagues on the phone. I'm on a Zoom that's watching as well, and we've been taking notes. So we've been through that process that you're on. We actually have in the earlier three neighborhoods, we have visions of what we want to see in our neighborhoods that are large scale projects on public property. One of them having been the Vision to Reality site that we were able to receive funding for. That, and the reason why it's called the Vision to Reality Stormwater Management Park, because that was the vision of the neighbors, the residents that they wanted to see. So we have projects that we just need funding for that are pretty much shovel ready to go forward with, because we've already been through that process that you all have been. And let me just say, it's really exciting to see what folks come up with, because no one knows a neighborhood better than the people that live there. And I can't emphasize that enough. What was difficult for me as a community leader was to remain objective, because although I live in the 7th Ward, I don't travel all sections of the 7th Ward. And when folks say this area floods, and I'm like, but it wasn't a priority. What ended up being the priority is the Vision to Reality stormwater management site. And so I'm here to tell you, be encouraged that community science works when you're engaging residents to determine not only where to choose a site, but understanding the science behind why this is going to work at this particular site and where we get the most bang for our buck with as far as funding goes. But the other thing is that we have to modernize our policies for the permitting process. Luckily for us, we have good relationships with city and state government to work through some of those permitting processes, but the policies have not kept up with the technology. And so that's a barrier for organizations who want to put in these nature-based solutions. The policies have to match up with where we're at right now, and it just doesn't. So for smaller organizations that may want to do this work, that don't have the money to pay the hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars in some cases for permitting, that is a barrier. And so that needs to be addressed, especially if you're talking about community organizations whose resources are limited. And so I just want to add that to the conversation, and to again thank the Biden administration for having the wisdom to realize that these projects need to be funded, and these actions are community driven. It's going to be community actions that's going to change the way we think about climate change and making it switch to being more resilient and adaptable communities.
Well, I can always count on Angela to end on the perfect note. So I really appreciate that. Before everyone exits, we do have a couple more poll questions for everyone. So please take a couple minutes to just let us know what you thought of this webinar. And if there are other things that you'd like to share, please go ahead and add those to the chat. I know we didn't get to all the questions, and there are always so many great ones. I really want to thank the speakers today for sharing and giving so much of their experience and time. And I want to thank the attendees for joining us and remind you that there will be 3 more in this series for regional reflections. We're moving over to the Great Lakes and then the Southwest and the Northwest. So please keep your eyes open, register, and join us as we continue these conversations. And thank you again to our presenters and our partners, the EPA and the White House, for all their work and sharing with us. So we'll leave that up. And also we have a survey that gives us even more information. So Erin, the EPI Center put that in the chat. So please do. And slides, recording, resources will all be shared with all registrants of the webinar. Thank you all so much. And we are perfectly timed, so very much appreciate it.